Hello, my dear. Same place, different time. And this morning, I was feeling kind of a lot of synchronicities around the topic of defining freedom for oneself. I could give you a lot of examples, and I would like to start with one grain of thought about. I will try to use different examples from different sections in life. And in a next step, I will show you the similarities that they have. And by that, kind of bringing all of those together into a kind of a concept which can actually help to enjoy the natural flow of life. So let's get into it. I have noticed from a career perspective, as you know, and as I've mentioned in previous videos, as a social worker, I have worked with many different groups of people, homeless people, people from prison, families, children, youngsters, volunteers. So a lot of different type of groups, categories of people, or at least that's what the social perspective would categorize the people to be able to work with those people and those groups. And one example that is for the purpose of this video is the example of homeless people being discriminated and then basically adapting to a new kind of, or let me rephrase that, by being discriminated, they would then suffer from social stigmata. And that social stigmata can be seen and detected on a very tangible level, which to outsiders and at a superficial look could look like freedom, when in fact the actions and the mannerisms behind those actions are basically built based on the discrimination. So one example is that men in Germany, homeless men in Germany, I have written a study about the perception of homeless men in German society and how that reflects back to their way of finding their own identity. So homeless people in general, not only men, of course, but based on the study I have done for many years ago for the university, I was focusing on homeless men. And so just alone the thought of somebody being homeless leads to us as a society to have a lot of perceptions about homelessness in general. We consciously and subconsciously have a fixed state of mind on how a person who is homeless should behave or should not behave. So we have a certain set of expectations around the definition of homelessness, even if that definition might look different for each and every one individually. For us, there can be common denominators, which it would be too deep to go into that video. That might be a topic for a different day. But just that said, through the eyes of society and by having a specific frame of mind on how homeless people should behave or shouldn't behave, that expectation level is combined also here on a subconscious and a very conscious and subconscious level, is combined and can be seen through different forms of stigmata. A stigmata, I would understand in a very easy way to put it, would be like a wound that results from discrimination. And that wound can make one person really strong and really revolutionary, really anti, whatever, and can really be a force that brings new life into that person, a new purpose, a new sense of identity. And to other people, that wound, that stigmata can have a very negative impact on their well-being, on their perception of identity, and on their role within society. So one specific example would be the newspaper for homeless people. I'm not sure. I know that some of you guys, and maybe you in specific, are watching from the US, from the Philippines, from wherever around the world you're currently watching from. There might be different systems in place for homeless people in your country. So I'm focusing my perception for this video right now on the perception in Germany. So in Germany, for homeless people, there is the idea, and it has become a very common thing to do for homeless people, is to write newspapers, to publish them, to print them basically, and then to sell those newspapers on the streets. By that, the financial gain through that selling the newspaper guarantees not only an income to the homeless people, but more so a money flow within the project of creating other newspapers, more newspapers. So that money can then be used for support systems for homeless people in order for them to be able to buy shoes, to get dry socks, which is a very big topic, and or rucksacks and camping accessoires. So there is basically a whole system behind the idea of having newspapers, and that system can be very tangible, especially in bigger cities. There are organizations that have created themselves in order to support that idea, and by that also giving us a new sense of purpose and a new sense of life for the homeless people, a new task they can do, and by that also ensure that they get one way back into socialization and getting back into the community as an approved member, so to speak, of the society, which is also why a lot of cities are allowing homeless people to sell newspapers, when at the same time they wouldn't allow, for example, for musicians to play on the streets, which of course is a different topic for another day. But basically they can find acceptance within society through their work. And a lot of people find also that providing money for a newspaper is being it is something that they would like to support. There can be studies found around that topic too, where it can be shown that people are more likely to support homeless people when they can see a deeper purpose behind their actions than just to give them money by that in the hand or by talking to them or whatever. So a very a very broad, a very interesting, I believe, a very interesting segment to do research about. Of course, there has to be a lot more research to be done, but for the sake of this video, I just wanted to state out that this is one thing that can be seen. So homeless people gaining back kind of society or gaining back fans, so to speak, within the society for being homeless. And that system of newspaper writing articles and newspaper reproduction leads to the example that I want to share with you. So in the study that I have done for the university, I could notice by talking to a lot of different homeless people in different towns, and based on the research that has been done up until that day in literature, theoretically, there were a lot of different ideas around how homeless people would adapt or basically find their own way within that system of newspaper reproduction. Let's call it that way, newspaper reproduction. And so, for example, there could be seen that there is a group of people, there can be seen men, homeless men, who would very strongly identify with the idea of the newspaper being a true purpose in their life, which offers them not only stability through the financial gains that might come out of it, but more so a time frame in which they would set up meetings with other people to discuss articles, a way to become creative again, a way to become okay from a societal perspective or perception, and to have an easier access to contact other people through that work. So it has a lot of great benefits. And some of the homeless men would highly identify with that newfound role as a homeless person. And they would do it very wholeheartedly. They would feel a lot of pleasure out of it. They would feel a lot of purpose for their own life out of it. And they would be really eager to provide their time, their creativity, their efforts into that project. So that's for one group of the homeless people. At the same time, there can be found another group of homeless people who would strongly disapprove that whole process, because they would feel that they don't want to be declared as homeless people writing newspapers, because they would feel, to them, it would feel like a reduction of their individuality, by basically reducing them to their status of homelessness. So they would strongly disapprove of that. They would not be part of that whole process. And they would also not be near homeless people who sell newspapers. They would purposely go to another section of the city or of the street and do their own thing. And at the same time, others would do a mixture of both. They would align with the process of creating the newspaper. They would prepare themselves for selling them on the streets. They would even have a specific outfit they would wear for that day. And at the other days within their lives, they would look, talk, and behave differently than they would do when they're in this role of selling a newspaper. So what I found interesting about that is that basically for all three groups, and there were other groups as well, but I don't mention them right now in this for the purpose of this video, but all of those three groups had their way in kind of finding their own way to deal with homelessness in regards to the newspaper. So basically saying, if the process of newspaper creation would be a process that we say we can tangible see that happening in cities in Germany, we can see that this is something that we acknowledge to be true. This is a fact, matter of fact. So this would be basically our starting line. That's why I would like to take this pencil to show that this would be kind of the starting line there. And from that line, we could find people who, just like dots, would connect on that line and would say, well, yeah, I'm in for it. I'm wholeheartedly doing the newspapers by myself and with others. And then there would be this different type of group where men would say, no, I strongly disapprove of that whole process, that whole idea and concept behind it. So I'm not on this line, but more so maybe I would find myself somewhere here or maybe even somewhere there. There's no judgment in up or below. It's just a different point in that whole perception, right? So the men who then would say, I don't approve with that, would find themselves right here. And then if we take the third group that for some instances approves of that line of truth, and in other instances maybe don't approve of it, they would maybe be somewhere here. And we could see then, if we do that, maybe not only for Germany, but worldwide, we could see like there's this newspaper project, and we could find a lot of different groups and people who in a way resonate with that, and in some ways maybe not. And that example is one example, as I said, based on the studies I have done on homelessness. Another example, if you want an easier one, would be that today in the morning I noticed that on social media there was, I could notice that there were like some commentators commenting on other commentators. So one commentator would say it would be good to commentate because it's free speech and it allows to have opinions, that people can form their own individual perspective about a certain topic. And then the other group of commentators would say, well, that's not good because we would then be more likely to judge the process and people's personalities, and especially on social media, that can be a tricky topic, right? So more so because we can only see a certain aspect. And so basically there was this whole topic and this whole discussion happening. So also here, I can see that there's this common denomination, which is basically, if we want to call it, commenting on social media. So, and then we can find a group that says, well, I agree with that. And then we can find a group that says, I don't agree with that. And we can find other different groups that might be resonating in some aspects and in other, they wouldn't. So also here we would have a fully facet of dots being in different places around one strong line that we define as the line of truth, if we want to call it that way. Right. So that would be another example. And one example from my personal environment, as of today, I could see that there's a community in which I'm currently are being part of, where there were like a discussion going on about different forms of, using social media in order to inform all of the community members. So the question was, how could that look like without discriminating all the opinions of everybody? And so the question was, what can be a program, what can be a platform, where can this happen? And so also here I could see a lot of different opinions, with the common denominator being the question about the platform, which would then be, again, here, this line. And there would be a lot of different assumptions, opinions, resonations. Is that even a word? Frequencies that resonate with the idea of a certain type of platform, and some of them who doesn't. Also here, we would have one line with a lot of different dots. So the question that arose for me today specifically was if there is ever true freedom. Because if the freedom that we personally feel is defined by something we are not agreeing to, and by basically stepping out of that line to become a dot somewhere else, I could find myself in kind of a philosophical dilemma. Because if we need this line to be there in order for a new path to arise, that new path can only happen because there is a common denominator line that we approve or disapprove with. But we put ourselves and our personal situation in one way or another by comparing it to that what is being true for us in that specific instance. And while I was thinking and reflecting about that, I noticed that even if, for an instance, we would say this line, we would just erase that line, whatever that is. We would just assume that there is no common line. How would that look like? Would that mean that we would now go back to the forest to start a living there? Be fully autonomative? So basically being able to produce our own food, to be independent of the current systems there are. Would that be freedom? Or would that mean that we would basically say no to everything that we already know? And of course, we say, of course, at the same time, yes to a lot of other things and ideas, like, for example, the sound of the birds, the nature. But it would take a very active part of us saying no to different aspects. So even here we can see that even the idea of being free from all of that lines bring us, in the last instance, to a line as well. So that's why I strongly think, at least today, that there is always a common line based upon which we then can define our own standpoint, our own opinion, our own personal progress, our spiritual awareness, whatever that might be and look like for you. We need to have a certain type of line in order to then be able to see where we are in that picture. Because it is not possible to be without it. We unconsciously or consciously always have that line somewhere within our lives. And what that does is, first of all, understanding if we believe this concept with the lines and the dots to be true for our personal lives, I believe that if we look at the lines and the dots, there can be retroactively, there can be seen a progress. Because the line that was here today and our dots that were here maybe right now, in this moment in time right here, throughout the years, that line maybe moves completely away. And maybe it becomes another line, which is somewhere here. And then maybe our position is not here anymore, but somewhere there, or maybe here, or wherever else you want to place it. But it's basically showing that the way to freedom is an evolutionary one. And that there always needs to be a truth which aligns with our personal values, morals, and one which doesn't. And so the process of continuously finding ourselves in comparison to that thing, thought, environment, idea, whatever that might look like for you. Just the thought and the active reflection of looking at that concept and defining our own dot position in regards to that line, that is something that allows, every time that we do it, it allows for a new freedom that can be found. And that new freedom, I also believe that it's probably a bit easier retroactively looking at it, because we cannot say what the future will bring, right? Because just because we're here at one point doesn't mean that we can totally break out and do something completely different. So since the future is really unpredictable, we can only take what we already know to be true. So that's why retroactively, I believe it's easier, because we have data that we can work with. And we can then see, based on our past decisions, what this line has been and where our decisions have led us in the picture. And once we take all that concept and we believe that it's true, we can then, as I mentioned before, come to the conclusion that it's an evolutionary process. It's a process of flow that is not fixed in itself. And in the next instance, we can go a step further and say that by being in that flow of process, we can, in a more clear way, understand that life is not about making the right decision, but more so about experimenting with the options we have at any given time and space in this adventurous life. And it's a constant re-evaluation of things we align with and things that we didn't, or we don't. And I believe that if we look at it from that angle, it can take a lot of pressure out of specifically perfectionism and trying to find the right choice, trying to make the right decision. Because the beauty about that concept is, even if, there's this line that we find to be true in one moment, and we find ourselves as dots being here in this specific moment, in another moment, because we evolve, right? And with the time, we maybe find more dots who are similar to us. We find more arguments. We find more things that feed into that idea, that strengthen our way forward, maybe going more like this way. And by the time the old line disappears and maybe becomes a new line. And so it's basically not becoming one final version, but more so enjoying the process of creation along the way. Knowing, and this is the other beautiful thing that comes with it, knowing and accepting that this line of truth in that specific moment where we are currently facing or finding ourselves being here, for example, we can then say that in this specific instance, this screenshot of our life is the best there is in that specific instance. Because the common denominator, the common truth, something that we find to be truthful in this specific moment. And based on that, we then take the decision to be right here. And if we can look at that, we can make it easier to ourselves to find more grace with our own process in life, and therefore even become more graceful in our interaction with others too. Because we know that even if they are not at the same dot spot as we are, but also they, for them, have that line of truth and have positioned themselves in their lives with their actions, their thoughts, into that specific dot frame. And so the process of freedom becomes not so much one fixed decision that we take one day and we have it, just like to press a button. But I believe that it can be a tangible concept where we find that finding freedom as a process, understanding it as a process, can align more and more with the version that we want to become, with the job that we want to achieve, with the thoughts we want to have, with the people we want to be surrounded with. And that acknowledgement, that awareness, automatically brings us to new lines of truth, where we can then at each and every individual step along our path, define by reflection, by doing shadow work, define if that's still the way to go or not. And also, mentioning shadow work, the word shadow work with this concept of the lines and the dots become also very tangible to work with and not so uncomfortable at all, But more so, and not saying that shadow work is comfortable. We all know that transformation and shadow work can be really painful and is part of the growth process, but that's not what this video is about. What I'm trying to say is that the shadow work, if we're looking at this concept right here, we go back to the dot. In that concept, shadow work would mean to ask ourselves, what has driven us to be exactly at this dot right here and not here or here or here or here or here or here, 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 right? So that specific decision to be right here, right now, compared to the line of truth that we have identified, that basically is then the shadow work. And we then maybe come to the realization that some of the things that we found true, remember the newspaper in the beginning of the video, that maybe was aligning with us, it doesn't resonate anymore, which is okay. And that awareness can be painful, but at the same time, it's part of that whole concept. Because by acknowledging that what has been true for us for some time is not true anymore, or doesn't align with us anymore. And that's why we have stepped out of it and moved to a different scene in that geographically constructed concept of finding freedom. I'm very well aware that there have been a lot of thoughts inside this video right now, and I truly hope that it wasn't too many. I tried to give different examples, because also with the examples of the commentators or the homeless people with their work on newspapers, or even my own community where I'm part at. And in regards to the question of finding the right platform, there's always this question underlying. Where do I see myself compared to that line of truth? And what is the line of truth that I can perceive to be true in this specific time frame? Because we all know that perception is a huge word. And just to talk about the perception would be a whole nother topic for another day. It's not so much a conscious decision, but more so one outcome. That line is a tangible outcome of what we currently are able to perceive as being the truth in one specific instance. And I believe if we can look at that for our own personal lives, it will become easier to look at others too. And to allow to their own process, however that looks like, in finding their own freedom. And by that, finding ours. I would be really curious about hearing your thoughts about that topic. And if you find that there were thoughts that resonated with you, I would appreciate if you leave a like or a comment, and we can, by that, put new grains of thoughts into each other's system. That would be lovely. And anyways, I appreciate you and your presence here with me in this video. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.